Colorado Territory, 1875. The frontier town of Eagle Creek nestled against the shadow of the Rocky Mountains like a child clinging to its mother's skirt, hungry for protection yet yearning for independence. As dawn broke over the jagged peaks, Quentin Quinn stood before the whitewashed church, his collar uncomfortably tight and his stomach tied in knots that no cowboy's rope skills could untangle. The townspeople called it the wedding of the season. The groom, 24 years old with shoulders broadened by years of ranch work, waited for his bride to appear. Quentin's normally tanned face had paled despite his time under the western sun. His clean-shaven jaw clenched as minutes stretched like prairie miles, his hazel eyes fixed on the church door that remained stubbornly closed. "She ain't coming, Quinn," whispered his best man after an hour had passed. The whispers grew louder as the sun climbed higher. By noon, the truth was unavoidable. Isabel Thornton, daughter of the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, had left Quentin Quinn standing at the altar. "A man on the frontier can only count on himself," Quentin muttered as he mounted his horse, abandoning the flowers, cake, and sympathetic glances. "Love is a luxury not meant for men who make their living from dust and cattle." The humiliation burned hotter than prairie fire. Every pitying look from the townsfolk felt like a branding iron against his pride. Within 3 days, Quentin had packed his meager belongings and departed Eagle Creek, leaving behind only a brief letter resigning his position as foreman at the Diamond Cross Ranch. The frontier was vast, and a man could disappear into it as easily as morning mist vanished under the rising sun. The only mistake was believing anyone could want a life with a man who has nothing but calloused hands and dreams, he told his horse as they headed north, toward unclaimed territory where nobody knew his name or his shame. 2 weeks of hard riding brought Quentin to the North Platte River Valley, where the land stretched wide and promising. Here, a man could rebuild without whispers following him like shadows. Here, he would focus only on survival and forget the foolish notion that someone like him deserved companionship. The small settlement of Willowbrook appeared without warning, just a cluster of cabins, a general store, and what passed for a hotel in these parts. Quentin had intended to pass through, but his horse had thrown a shoe, and circumstances forced him to stop. "Need a blacksmith," he told the wrinkled proprietor of the general store, a man who introduced himself as Samuel Jenkins. "Got no dedicated smith," Jenkins replied, sizing up the stranger. "But Madelyn Jenkins over at the North Homestead has a forge my niece learned from her pa before the typhoid took him. She handles the valley's horseshoeing needs now." "A woman blacksmith?" Quentin couldn't hide his skepticism. Jenkins chuckled. "This is frontier country, son. Out here you either learn to do what needs doing or you don't survive." With reluctance born of both exhaustion and skepticism, Quentin followed the crudely drawn map to the Jenkins homestead. The property appeared well-maintained, unusual for a woman alone. A small cabin stood proudly beside a larger barn where smoke curled from a stone chimney. Fields of wheat rippled like golden waves in the autumn breeze. As he approached, a figure emerged from the barn, silhouetted against the setting sun. Quentin's first impression was of movement, graceful despite worn work clothes. As she stepped forward, the sunset illuminated her features and Quentin's breath caught in his throat. Madelyn Jenkins stood 23 years of age with a quiet confidence that needed no announcement. Her blonde hair was gathered in a practical braid that fell to her mid-back, escaping wisps framing a face that needed no cosmetics to enhance its natural beauty. Her dress was simple, a practical blue calico covered by a leather apron bearing scorch marks and soot stains, yet something in her direct gaze suggested she was anything but ordinary. "Mr. Quinn, I presume," her voice carried across the yard, neither overly delicate nor unnecessarily harsh. "Uncle Sam sent word you were coming. I understand your horse needs attention." Quentin nodded, momentarily forgetting his manners. "Yes, ma'am, thrown shoe about 3 miles back, had to walk him careful since." She approached without hesitation, running skilled hands down his horse's leg with practiced ease. "I can fix this, might take an hour." "You're welcome to wait by the house, there's fresh water in the bucket." "I can help," he offered automatically. A slight smile curved her lips. "Can you now, and what does a cowboy know about a forge?" "Enough to pump a bellows while you work," he countered. "Seems only fair." Something passed across her face, perhaps surprise at his willingness to assist rather than wait to be served. "Very well, Mr. Quinn, follow me." Inside the barn, Quentin discovered a fully equipped blacksmith's forge. As Madelyn stoked the fire and prepared her tools, he observed her movements, precise, economical, nothing wasted. His curiosity overcame his usual reservation. "How does a young woman come to be a blacksmith in territory like this?" he asked as he pumped the bellows as directed. "My father believed frontier daughters should be as capable as sons," she answered without looking up, her focus on heating the metal. "He taught me alongside my brothers. When the fever came through 3 years ago, it took my parents and both brothers within a week. I was the only one left to tend the homestead." She spoke matter-of-factly without seeking sympathy, but Quentin recognized the determined set of her jaw, the look of someone who had faced loss and refused to surrender. "I'm sorry," he offered, the words feeling inadequate. Madelyn simply nodded. "Life in the West doesn't promise fairness, Mr. Quinn, only opportunity for those willing to work. Now pump harder, this iron won't heat itself." For the next hour, they worked in surprising harmony. Quentin found himself admiring her skill as she shaped the horseshoe with confident hammer blows. When she finally secured it to his horse's hoof, the sun had fully set and lantern light illuminated the barn. "You do good work," he acknowledged, inspecting the finished result. "I do necessary work," she corrected. "Will you be staying in Willowbrook long?" Something in her direct gaze made evasion impossible. "I hadn't planned to. Just passing through." "Running from or toward something, Mr. Quinn?" The question came unexpectedly, piercing through his carefully constructed defenses. "That's rather personal, Miss Jenkins." She nodded. "So it is. But men who just pass through usually have reasons." With that, she began cleaning her tools. "It's late. The hotel in town is barely habitable. You're welcome to use the lean-to attached to the barn for the night. There's fresh hay for your horse." The offer surprised him. That's mighty trusting of a woman alone. Madelyn reached behind a workbench and produced a shotgun. "I'm trusting, Mr. Quinn. Not foolish." For the first time since leaving Eagle Creek, Quentin laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even him. "Fair enough, Miss Jenkins. I accept your hospitality and promise you won't need that shotgun tonight." The lean-to proved more comfortable than many places Quentin had slept during his years as a cowhand. When morning came, he found himself reluctant to leave. Something about Madelyn Jenkins, her competence, her directness, intrigued him in ways he hadn't expected. Over breakfast, which she insisted on providing despite his protests, Quentin learned more about Willowbrook. The settlement was growing but vulnerable. Raiders from the north occasionally threatened the scattered homesteads, and the nearest marshal was 2 days' ride away. "We protect our own," Madelyn explained, pouring coffee. "But winter's coming and 3 families lost men to illness or accidents last year. We're short-handed for what needs doing." Quentin recognized an opening when he heard one. "Are you offering me work, Miss Jenkins?" She met his gaze steadily. "I'm stating facts, Mr. Quinn. What you do with them is your choice, but a man with ranch experience would find his skills welcome here. At least through winter." The invitation tempted him more than he cared to admit. His original plan, to keep moving until the memory of humiliation faded, suddenly seemed hollow compared to the prospect of purposeful work. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "Need to retrieve my things from town first." Madelyn nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "The Anderson place a mile east needs the most help. They lost James Anderson to a logging accident in spring. His widow has 3 young children and 80 acres she can't manage alone." By nightfall, Quentin had arranged to winter at the Anderson homestead, helping the widow prepare for the coming season in exchange for lodging in her barn and meals. The arrangement suited everyone. Mrs. Anderson gained much-needed help, the children delighted in having a cowboy on the property, and Quentin found purpose in tasks that left him too exhausted to dwell on Eagle Creek. Yet despite his busy days, Quentin found reasons to visit the Jenkins homestead regularly. Sometimes he brought horseshoes needing adjustment, other times he offered help with heavier tasks around her property. Madelyn never turned him away, though she made it clear she managed fine on her own. "You don't have to help me to justify stopping by, Mr. Quinn," she told him one November afternoon as they repaired her roof together. Conversation is reason enough for a visit in these parts. Her directness continually caught him off guard. Most women I've known prefer a reason beyond conversation. Then you've known the wrong women, she replied simply, hammering a nail with perfect precision. Out here, honest words are as valuable as any goods from a mercantile. As winter settled over the valley, Quentin found himself sharing more of his past than he'd intended, though never mentioning Isabel or the wedding. Something about Madelyn's straightforward manner made pretense seem foolish. Their friendship grew during the long winter evenings. Quentin began joining Madelyn for supper once weekly, bringing game he'd hunted or preserves from Mrs. Anderson's cellar as his contribution. Their conversations ranged from practical matters to philosophy, and Quentin discovered in Madelyn an intellect as sharp as her forged tools. "You surprise me, Miss Jenkins," he admitted one evening as they discussed a passage from Emerson she'd been reading. "Most settlers barely have time for survival, let alone literature." "The mind needs tending as much as fields or livestock," she countered. "Father insisted education continued despite frontier demands. What good is surviving if we become less than who we could be in the process?" Her words stayed with him long after he'd returned to the Anderson barn that night. For years, Quentin had defined himself by what he could do: ride, rope, work cattle. Isabel's rejection had reinforced his belief that such skills weren't enough to make him worthy of companionship. Yet Madelyn valued him for his thoughts as much as his labor. December brought heavy snows that isolated the homesteads. Quentin split his time between the Anderson place and helping neighbors, including Madelyn. Christmas approached and the settlement planned a gathering at the small church, an opportunity for isolated families to share fellowship. 2 days before Christmas, disaster struck. Raiders from the north, desperate men driven by winter hunger, attacked the easternmost homestead, stealing livestock and supplies. The warning reached Willowbrook by midday, carried by the injured farmer who'd escaped on foot. "They're headed this way," the man gasped to the gathered townspeople. 6 men, well-armed, said they'd take what they needed from each homestead. The settlement had no official leadership, but in crisis, people looked to those with experience. Quentin found himself organizing the defense alongside Samuel Jenkins and 2 other men with military backgrounds. "The women and children should gather at the church," one man suggested. "We can defend them there." "And abandon our homes and livestock," Madelyn's voice rose above the murmurs of agreement. "Everything we've worked for." "Better than risking lives," the man countered. Quentin studied the determined faces around him. "What if we don't have to choose? The raiders don't know the valley like we do. We could set up a defense that protects both people and property." His strategy was simple but effective: strategic positioning of armed men at key points along the raiders' likely approach, with signals established to communicate. The settlers would appear more numerous than they were, while women skilled with firearms would provide backup defense at the homesteads. As they dispersed to their positions, Madelyn caught Quentin's arm. "Be careful," she said, her usual composure momentarily fractured by concern. "These men have nothing to lose." Something in her expression warmed him despite the bitter cold. "I'll return, Miss Jenkins. You have my word." The confrontation came at dawn. The raiders, finding unexpected resistance at every turn, eventually retreated after a brief exchange of gunfire that wounded 2 settlers and 1 raider. By midday, the danger had passed, and the community gathered to tend the wounded and reassess their defenses. In the aftermath, something shifted in how the settlers viewed Quentin. No longer just a passing cowhand, he had become someone they trusted with their safety. The Christmas gathering 2 days later became a celebration of community resilience, with Quentin reluctantly accepting thanks from many. "You're becoming indispensable," Madelyn observed as they shared punch beside the modest Christmas tree. "Quite a change from the man who was just passing through." Quentin watched the families dancing to a fiddle player's tune. "Never expected to find a place to belong again," he admitted. The words slipped out before he could reconsider them. Madelyn's expression softened. "Again, so there was somewhere before." The moment hung between them, an opportunity for honesty that terrified him. Before he could respond, Samuel Jenkins called for attention, announcing plans to establish a proper town council come spring. "And I nominate Quentin Quinn for the first council," the old man declared to general approval. The nomination startled Quentin. Commitment to a place meant vulnerability, something he'd sworn to avoid after Eagle Creek. Yet looking at the hopeful faces around him, particularly Madelyn's quiet smile, he found himself nodding acceptance. January brought the harshest weather of the season. Blizzards isolated homesteads for days at a time, and concern grew for outlying families. When the storms briefly abated, Quentin organized supply checks, personally riding to Madelyn's homestead despite the treacherous conditions. He found her barn damaged by heavy snow, the roof partially collapsed over her forge. Without discussion, he spent 3 days helping rebuild, sleeping in her lean-to despite the bitter cold. On the third evening, exhausted from labor in freezing conditions, they sat before her hearth fire sharing a simple meal. "Why did you really come to Willowbrook, Quentin?" Madelyn asked, using his given name for the first time. "The truth this time." Perhaps it was exhaustion or the warmth of firelight on her face, but Quentin found himself answering honestly. "I was running away, from humiliation, from a place where everyone knew I wasn't enough." "Enough for what?" For her, the words emerged barely above a whisper. "I was to be married last summer. She didn't come, left me standing before the whole town. The rancher's daughter decided a foreman wasn't worth keeping her promise to." Understanding dawned in Madelyn's eyes. "So you came here believing you weren't enough for anyone?" "I came here believing the frontier is no place for illusions about companionship," he corrected, "that a man is safer keeping to himself." She studied him thoughtfully, and now, "Do you still believe that?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither had acknowledged. Before he could answer, a pounding at the door interrupted Samuel Jenkins with urgent news. "The Carson child is sick, burning fever. His mother's asking for help. The doctor's away delivering the Thompson baby." Madelyn immediately began gathering supplies. "I'll go. My mother trained as a nurse before coming west." "The trail's nearly impassable," Quentin objected. "At least let me accompany you." The journey to the Carson homestead tested both riders and horses. Nearly 2 miles from their destination, disaster struck when Madelyn's horse broke through snow-covered ice at a creek crossing. She was thrown into the freezing water, and only Quentin's quick action prevented her from being swept downstream. Soaked and rapidly succumbing to cold, Madelyn could no longer ride. Quentin abandoned her horse, placed her before him on his saddle, and wrapped her in his coat despite her protests. "You'll freeze," she objected through chattering teeth. "And you certainly will if I don't," he countered, urging his horse forward. "Stay awake, Madelyn, talk to me." For the remainder of the journey, he kept her conscious by demanding responses, questions about her forge work, her favorite books, anything to keep her mind active despite the cold threatening to shut it down. They reached the Carson place with Madelyn semi-conscious in his arms. The next hours blurred as they fought to warm her while she, even in her weakened state, directed Mrs. Carson in treating her feverish child. By dawn, both patients showed improvement, though Madelyn remained weak from her ordeal. When she finally slept, Quentin collapsed in a chair beside her bed, refusing to leave despite his own exhaustion. He awoke to find her watching him, color returned to her cheeks. "You saved my life," she said simply. "You'd have done the same." He shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "Yes," she agreed, "but that doesn't diminish what you risked. You could have died from exposure." He looked away. "Some things matter more than safety." "Like what?" The question demanded honesty he wasn't sure he was ready to give. "Like people you care about." February brought milder weather and increasing activity as the settlement prepared for spring planting. Quentin found himself committed to staying, purchasing a small parcel of land adjoining the Anderson property with money he'd saved from his cowhand days. His friendship with Madelyn deepened following their shared ordeal. They rarely spoke directly of personal feelings, yet something had shifted between them, a tacit understanding that neither was simply passing through the other's life. Their routines intertwined naturally. Quentin helped construct a proper smithy to replace her damaged barn forge. Madelyn advised on his land purchase and plans for a cabin. They shared meals several times weekly, and settlers began to notice, though neither acknowledged the speculation their friendship generated. In late February, a letter arrived from Eagle Creek. Quentin recognized the handwriting immediately: Isabel Thornton. For days, the unopened letter burned in his pocket as he debated whether to read it. "Bad news?" Madelyn asked when she noticed his distraction during a shared supper. He hesitated before producing the letter. "Not sure, haven't read it." Understanding crossed her features. From her, the woman who. Yes, he stared at the envelope. Not sure it matters anymore what she has to say. Madelyn considered him carefully. "If it truly didn't matter, you'd have burned it unopened. Perhaps you need closure to fully move forward." Her insight, as always, cut through his defenses. That night, alone in his temporary lodgings, Quentin finally opened the letter. Isabel's words were what he might have expected months ago: explanations, apologies, hints that she'd reconsidered. Her father's ranch was struggling financially, perhaps marriage to a skilled foreman no longer seemed beneath her. What surprised Quentin was his own reaction. The words that once would have tied his stomach in knots now seemed hollow, manipulations from someone who saw him as useful rather than valued. The humiliation that had driven him from Eagle Creek had transformed into gratitude for an escape he hadn't known he needed. The following day, he showed the letter to Madelyn as they worked together planting early seedlings in her cold frames. "She wants you back," Madelyn observed neutrally after reading. "She wants what I can provide," Quentin corrected. "There's a difference I didn't recognize before." Madelyn's hands stilled in the soil. "And what will you do?" "Nothing." He took the letter back, deliberately tearing it in half. "My life is here now." Something flickered in her eyes, relief perhaps, though she masked it quickly. "Because of the land." "The council position." "Because here I'm valued for who I am, not what I can offer." His gaze held hers. "Because here I've found people worth staying for." The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities, until Samuel Jenkins arrived with news that broke the tension. The spring supply wagon train would arrive within the week, bringing much-needed goods and mail. The entire settlement buzzed with preparation for the wagon train's arrival. New supplies meant construction could begin on several delayed projects, including the town's first proper school. Quentin found himself appointed to the committee overseeing material distribution, further evidence of his accepted place in the community. On the morning the wagons were expected, disaster struck again. The Carson boy, recovered from his winter illness, rushed into town with terrifying news. 3 armed men had taken over his family's homestead, holding his parents hostage while demanding supplies and horses. Remnants of the winter raiders, Samuel Jenkins surmised grimly, desperate and dangerous. With the nearest law enforcement still days away, the settlement again looked to Quentin for leadership. The situation required immediate action, but caution as well. Hostages meant they couldn't simply confront the raiders directly. "I need to get close enough to assess the situation," Quentin told the hastily assembled group. "These men want supplies and escape, not bloodshed if they can avoid it." "I'm coming with you," Madelyn stated firmly. "The Carsons know me from treating their boy. I can approach under the pretense of a medical follow-up without raising suspicion." Quentin wanted to refuse. The thought of Madelyn in danger twisted his gut, but her logic was sound. Together they devised a plan. Madelyn would approach openly while Quentin and 2 other men circled around to position themselves strategically. The tension as they approached the Carson homestead was palpable. Madelyn drove her wagon boldly to the front door, medical bag visible beside her, while Quentin and the others used the rolling terrain to remain hidden as they moved into position. From his vantage point, Quentin watched as Madelyn was allowed inside after some discussion. Minutes stretched like hours as he waited, rifle ready, for the signal they'd arranged. A particular window shutter opened if she determined the family was unharmed. When the shutter finally moved, Quentin felt a moment's relief before focusing on the next phase. Through field glasses, he could occasionally glimpse movement inside, Madelyn apparently examining the Carson boy while engaging the raiders in conversation. What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. One raider emerged from the house, heading toward the barn, creating the opportunity they'd hoped for by splitting the group. Before Quentin could signal the others to take advantage, shots erupted from inside the house. Heart pounding, Quentin abandoned caution and raced toward the homestead, barely aware of the other men following. The raider by the barn wheeled at the sound of gunfire, raising his weapon toward Quentin, who fired first. The man fell as Quentin reached the porch. Inside, he found chaos, one raider dead on the floor, another wounded and restrained by Mr. Carson, who had suffered a bullet graze to his shoulder. Mrs. Carson huddled with her son in the corner. And Madelyn stood with a small derringer still clutched in her hand, face pale but composed. "They were going to take me when they left," she explained as Quentin reached her side. "I couldn't allow that." Later, when the wounded raider had been secured and the Carson family settled, Quentin and Madelyn rode back toward town in silence. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving both shaken by how narrowly disaster had been averted. "You could have been killed," Quentin finally said as they approached the settlement. "As could you, rushing in after the shooting started," she countered, "yet here we both are." He reined his horse to a stop, forcing her to do the same. "Madelyn, when I heard those shots," he struggled to find words adequate to the fear he'd experienced. "I realized something I can no longer deny." She waited, her eyes steady on his face. "I came to Willowbrook believing I needed nobody, that attachments were weaknesses a man on the frontier couldn't afford," his voice roughened with emotion. "I was wrong. Some connections make us stronger, not weaker. What I feel for you." "Quentin," she interrupted softly, "I've been waiting months for you to recognize what everyone else in the settlement already sees between us." The simplicity of her acknowledgement stunned him. "You know." "I knew my own heart," she corrected. "Yours seemed more confused by the past." In that moment, with spring sunshine warming the awakening prairie around them, Quentin recognized the final truth. The altar in Eagle Creek had never been his proper destination. The path had always been leading here, to this strong, remarkable woman who saw him clearly and valued what she saw. "I love you, Madelyn Jenkins," he said, the words emerging with surprising ease after months of guarded emotions. "Not for what you can offer or provide, but for who you are. I think perhaps I have since you first stood in your forge and called me on my evasions." Her smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face. "That's fortunate, Quentin Quinn, as I've loved you since you insisted on pumping my bellows rather than sitting idle while I worked." The wagon train's arrival later that day became a double celebration, new supplies and the announcement of their engagement. Samuel Jenkins, beaming with satisfaction that his introduction had led to such a match, insisted on hosting the upcoming wedding at the town's newly established gathering hall. Spring flowed into summer as Quentin built their cabin on his land, incorporating a proper smithy for Madelyn's work. The settlement flourished with new arrivals and expanding commerce. When the territorial governor sent representatives to officially recognize Willowbrook as an established town, Quentin, now head of the town council, presented their charter with Madelyn proudly at his side. Their wedding in July drew people from homesteads throughout the region. Unlike his abandoned ceremony in Eagle Creek, this celebration felt genuine, a community gathering to honor a union that had already proven its strength through shared trials and triumphs. As Madelyn walked toward him in a simple white dress adorned with blue ribbons that matched her eyes, her blonde hair crowned with wildflowers, Quentin finally understood the gift he'd received when Isabel left him waiting. Not humiliation but liberation. Not loss, but the chance to find something infinitely more valuable, a partner who saw his worth beyond what he could provide, who matched his strength with her own. "Ready to build our future together," Madelyn whispered as they joined hands before the minister. "I already am," Quentin replied, knowing with absolute certainty that the frontier wasn't too harsh for love after all. It simply required the right kind of love, strong enough to weather its challenges and flourish despite them. The same townsfolk who had once witnessed his greatest humiliation now celebrated his greatest joy. As Quentin and Madelyn Quinn began their life together, the lessons of their journey remained. That sometimes being left behind opens the path forward, that strength comes in recognizing our need for connection rather than denying it, and that even in the unforgiving territory of the American frontier, hearts find ways to create home in unexpected places.